Good morning. Bonjour à tous. Je suis Charlie Angus. I'm speaking this morning on the revelations from the Facebook whistleblower, Madame Frances Haugen, that has rocked the American political establishment, and her testimony has lit a political fire in multiple jurisdictions as politicians around the world are confronting the need to monitor and regulate the unprecedented power of the tech giants. Ms. Haugen reveals that Facebook knew that its algorithms are driving hate content and leading to breakdown in civic engagement. That Facebook made the decision to incentivize profits through its use of its algorithms over the well-being of its users, and this has resulted, according to Ms. Haugen, in this exploitation of the algorithms is now posing fundamental threats to democratic life. She states that Facebook knew that Instagram was having serious negative impacts on young teens, even as they were pushing their platforms to children. And as shocking as Ms. Haugen's revelations are, they are absolutely not surprising. In 2018-2019, the All-Party Parliamentary Ethics Committee initiated a major investigation into Facebook. And our committee identified many of the red flags that Ms. Haugen has subsequently confirmed. And we supplied the Trudeau government at that time with multiple recommendations to address these issues that have subsequently been proven by Ms. Haugen's testimony. Unfortunately, Mr. Trudeau and the government ignored much of the key elements, and they continue to mishandle the tech file. But because of the decision of Justin Trudeau to call an early election, he has the opportunity now to set things right, because all his tech legislation, which was so badly flawed, has been put in the garbage can of history. So now we get a chance to rethink and do this right. So with the election finished, I'm inviting Mr. Trudeau to work with us, and I'm offering the Prime Minister 6 simple steps for dealing with Facebook and the dataopolies. Number one, it's all about the algorithms. That's where we need to focus, because the massive use of algorithms and AI and their deliberate misuse by Facebook must be addressed. The corporate heads at both Facebook and YouTube have realized that there's way more money to be made by driving viewers to extremist content than providing a wide array of choice. And the result of this, I think all of us can say, we've seen a breakdown of civil discourse. We've all had friends or relatives who've fallen down the rabbit hole of conspiracy theory and political marginalization. In other jurisdictions, the distortion of the content through the use of algorithms has led to violence and the breakdown of civic engagement. For the health of our democracy, we need to force accountability and transparency as to how the algorithms are being exploited. So that's number one. Number two, it's all about the privacy rights of the citizens of Canada. This was at the heart of the Cambridge Analytica scandal. It revealed how data mercenaries can misuse our private information and weaponize it to undermine democracy. Unfortunately, the Liberal government's promise to update Canada's privacy laws would actually put more power into the hands of big tech while stripping the powers of the Privacy Commissioner. The Privacy Commissioner requires tools and penalties to hold big tech and companies like Facebook accountable. The Liberal C11 would actually make it much harder for the Privacy Commissioner to go after tech companies. So the Liberals need to stop putting barriers in his place. I advise the Prime Minister to go back to the drawing board and bring back privacy legislation that puts the citizen and the citizen's rights at the heart of all new privacy legislation. Number three, forget the Crtc. They are not a credible means to regulate the data giants. The Liberals have put forward a 1980s solution for 21st century problem. Bill C-10 was a political dumpster fire, led by Minister Guilbeault, who I think clearly didn't understand the file. And the fact that the government attempted to treat Facebook merely as a broadcaster missed the point on so many key areas. Now, clearly, Facebook and YouTube and other tech giants need to pay into the arts system because they're deriving enormous revenues from the arts. But the CRTC is the last agency we want overseeing the massive power of Silicon Valley and the complexities of the digital realm. So that leads me to point number 4. It's time for the federal government to join the 21st century, and that rather than relying on outdated institutions like the Competition Bureau or the CRTC, it's time for the federal government to establish a regulator that actually understands this file. To this end, the New Democrats are offering the establishment of a new officer of Parliament, an officer of digital rights and technology. And this officer, of course, must have the budget, the tools, and the order-making powers to handle the questions of the complex issues of AI, the proliferation of online hate and disinformation, and the need to ensure transparency in the algorithms. Number 5, tax the SOBs. Facebook and the tech giants have had an extremely unfair advantage over domestic companies because they are not paying taxes. Now, Krista Friedland says that the Liberals are going to now give Facebook a 2-year holiday. They were supposed to start paying tax at the beginning of next year, but she's going to wait until the government negotiates with the OECD. And the OECD deal might be okay, but there are serious questions about whether or not this new deal with the OECD will result in Facebook actually paying less tax in Canada than they would under Canadian domestic law that was coming in. I think we all agree, given the massive power that they have over the market and over citizens, that we need to know that they're actually paying taxes properly in Canada. Number 6, and this is my final point, let's talk about the big tobacco effect. One of the really disturbing allegations from Ms. Hoogan was that Facebook knew that its Instagram programs were having damaging impacts on young teens, particularly as more and more children are using the platforms. This is something we began to look at in the parliamentary study, where it's become clear that the addictive nature of big tech is not accidental, it is deliberate. The programmers are testing and innovating tricks and tools to keep people on the platform regardless of whether it is good psychologically or for their social health. It's like the use of the nicotine delivery mechanisms that were deliberately put into cigarettes. And we don't have any idea of how damaging these technologies are, of the transformation that's happening cognitively in young people or in any age. The All-Party Committee called for strong investment in research to map out the cognitive and social impacts of this technology. I'm urging the Trudeau government to make investments in looking into the effects of the tools that are being used to create addiction online and the cognitive impacts it has, because we need to have the baseline data now for what I believe will be the mass class action lawsuits for the future. So those are 6 straightforward points that I'm offering this morning in response to the Facebook whistleblowers' allegations that I think we all agree are deeply troubling, and I'm inviting the Prime Minister to work with us to actually get a credible tech and privacy rights regime in Canada. I'm willing to take questions.
And we'll now take questions, starting with question on the phone. Quick reminder, 1 question, 1 follow-up per reporter. Nous allons maintenant passer aux questions, commençant par les questions au téléphone. Un petit rappel, une question suivie par journaliste. Opératrice, avons-nous une première question?
Thank you. Merci. Première question de Christian Noël de Radio-Canada. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Bonjour, M. Angus. J'aurais une question à vous poser sur un sujet autre ce matin, si vous me le permettez, concernant la visite de M. Trudeau dans l'Ouest à Kamloops. J'aimerais d'abord comprendre de votre côté, est-ce que vous y voyez un geste de bonne volonté ou autre chose?
Well, c'est clair, il y a beaucoup de frustration dans les communautés autochtones au Canada par le refus de M. Trudeau de parler avec les survivants et les communautés de Kamloops. Donc, je remercie M. Trudeau pour cette visite ce matin, mais c'est clair, c'est nécessaire pour le gouvernement fédéral de mettre en place un plan crédible de répondre aux les questions des les morts cachés, les tombées cachées dans les écoles pensionnats. C'est nécessaire pour le gouvernement de travailler avec les communautés autochtones, de mettre en place un plan pour répondre aux les crimes des l'Église catholique et pour assurer pour la prosecution des perpétrateurs des crimes.
Donc, pour donner un coup de main à ce moment-là aux communautés autochtones de cette façon-là, du point de vue politique, vous voyez cette visite-là comment?
Ouais, le site des tombes cachées à Kamloops, je pense, représente un crime international, un crime contre l'humanité, les droits humanitaires. C'est nécessaire pour le Premier ministre de reconnaître l'importance de parler avec les communautés et pour assurer que le Canada va répondre à ce crime, un crime qui représente un crime international. Yes, I'm the Prime Minister. There's been a lot of frustration in Canada and in First Nation communities of the Prime Minister's refusal to go to Kamloops up till now. I leave it to the people of Kamloops to meet with the Prime Minister and what they want to get out of this meeting. But what we need to get from this Prime Minister is a recognition that what happened at Kamloops and the other residential schools represent crimes against humanity. The mass taking of children, the mass graves, these are crimes that have to be addressed. We cannot address it simply locally. There has to be a national response that is credible, because these crimes and the taking of the children represent, to me, something that represents an international crime against humanity.
Operator, next question.
Thank you. Merci. Our next question is from Olivia Stefanovich with CBC News. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Good morning, Mr. Angus. I have similar questions to my colleagues. There was a lot of criticism, as you mentioned, against the Prime Minister about him missing the visit to Kamloops on September 30th and several other invitations from the chief. I'm wondering what you think the Prime Minister can do to demonstrate, to sort of make up for this or demonstrate a reset of this relationship.
The decision by the Prime Minister to go on vacation on September 30th was a slap in the face to reconciliation in this country. The failure of the Prime Minister to go to Kamloops once the unmarked graves were found, to me, also represented a failure of leadership. We're dealing with historic crimes about the taking of children, about the attempted destruction of the Indigenous people in Canada. So it's really important for the Prime Minister to understand that words and nice words won't cut it at this time. We need to see clear action. To that, there needs to be put in place a credible investigation unit. We have called for a special prosecutor to actually treat these crimes as a national issue as opposed to merely local issues, that there has to be the funds in place to help the communities who are dealing with the trauma of trying to now identify the unmarked graves at the residential schools across Canada. And I think also that the Prime Minister needs to send a message to survivors that he's going to start to work with them. And that example, of course, is St. Anne's Residential School, where we now have evidence of a massive miscarriage of justice committed against the survivors of St. Anne's because the government suppressed evidence of the crimes committed against the children. Rather than spending millions on lawyers, the Prime Minister needs to say he will make good on the promise of reconciliation by sitting down with the survivors.
Are you planning to take action when the House resumes to sort of compel the government to take this action, such as recognizing that what happened in residential schools were crimes against humanity?
We have, as New Democrats, working with the Indigenous communities and Indigenous leadership, know how important it is for Parliament to send a clear message. This is above politics. This is about Canada's historic reckoning. We have an opportunity in this Parliament to make that reckoning be realized in a concrete manner to move forward as a nation. There is no moving forward as a nation until we start to address these. So we will certainly be using all the tools at our disposal to try and to compel this government to actually live up to the promises of reconciliation and to live up to the calls of action for the truth and reconciliation. To that end, I would also say that the clock is ticking down on the Prime Minister's decision of whether or not he is going to appeal the Human Rights Tribunal ruling, the federal court ruling that found his government has failed in terms of their obligations to compensate Indigenous children in the broken child welfare system. I say that because if you look at the calls to action of the Truth and Reconciliation, the whole first series of calls from the Truth and Reconciliation are to fix the damage that's being done to this generation of Indigenous children. And the Prime Minister is going to have to announce very soon whether or not he's going to go back to court and spend millions more denying justice to this generation of Indigenous children, or he's going to accept the fact that his government has been found guilty of willful and reckless discrimination against First Nation children and end the discrimination.
We will now take a few questions in the room. Nous allons maintenant prendre quelques questions dans la salle. Mike?
Mr. Angus, I want to ask you on your announcement today first, how can you expect some of these social media companies like YouTube and Facebook to quash misinformation when it's very profitable for them and it appears to drive some engagement? And the other question related to that is, do you have concerns that too much regulation may drive some of these companies out of Canada?
I think what we're dealing with is an international problem. And I've certainly, with my work internationally with the International Grant Committee, we're hearing from legislators around the world who are fed up with the fact that Facebook, YouTube, the other tech giants seem to think that domestic law is somehow quaint. We're talking about a profit system that is driving disinformation, that is driving a breakdown of social engagement and democracy. We as parliamentarians have an obligation to protect democracy. This is not about over-regulating Facebook. It's about saying to them, if you are going to use the algorithms to drive extremist content, then you need to be held accountable for that. This is a reasonable step to take. On the other hand, Facebook could say, yeah, we are going to start to have more transparency in the algorithms, so we're not driving people to Holocaust denial. So we're not driving people to extremism. We're not driving people to, anti-vax. That we're actually giving people an opportunity to see the full slate of ideas that are out there. That's not what the algorithms do now. The algorithms drive you to smaller and smaller and smaller worldviews because it keeps you on the platform. So they have an accountability to Canadians, and they have an accountability internationally.
For my follow-up, I just want to turn to another subject, and that's all the cases of military misconduct. Global News interviewed the woman at the center of the allegations against Admiral Art MacDonald. So Heather MacDonald said that she's disappointed the military justice system is not able to prosecute the most senior military officials. So I wanted to know what you think needs to be changed, and why do you think it's taking so long?
I think all Canadians are deeply concerned about the ongoing allegations at the highest level of sexual misconduct that is failing to protect the people who are stepping up to serve our nation. I think that the Prime Minister and his minister have failed on this file, clearly. There needs to be a mechanism in place to show that there is going to be accountability for those who have power and who misuse it to sexually harass or sexually exploit people who are serving in our military.
Next question, Anya.
Hi, Anya Kadadeglia, National Post. As you mentioned, this is an international problem. Facebook is a giant, obviously international company. Even if this new regulator were established, how much do you think it could actually do to regulate Facebook? What kind of jurisdiction would it have?
Well, I think the idea that the Prime Minister has put forward is that the CRTC can do this. This is a ridiculous idea. The CRTC sets up to deal with broadcasters. Facebook is not a broadcaster. It does do broadcasting, but it is a much broader issue. And so we need to have someone who actually, I think, has the expertise in this area. And that's why the creation of a new officer of Parliament for Digital Rights and Technology, to me, seems to be the reasonable solution. And could it work? Absolutely, because we look at the power of the role of the Privacy Commissioner. It was the Canadian Privacy Commissioner who identified the loopholes that allowed the Cambridge Analytica scandal to go forward. If that Privacy Commissioner had had the power at that time to hold Facebook accountable, maybe the Cambridge Analytica scandal wouldn't have happened. Our Privacy Commissioner does incredible work of taking on the tech giants, but he's being hobbled by the fact that the Prime Minister is not giving him all the tools necessary, order-making tools and the penalty tools. So I think it's probably better for us to establish a standalone officer of Parliament who reports to Parliament, who understands tech, who understands algorithms, than to turn it over to the, the schlemazel that is the CRTC.
Bill C-10, what do you think about the government's upcoming online harms legislation, which would create a new regulator that would have powers to force social media companies to take down posts within 24 hours?
Well, I think the Prime Minister needs to do this right because, for example, we dealt with serious allegations about Pornhub and MindGeek, of sexual assault, of child pornography. And we saw that in Canada and under this government, there was absolutely no willingness of the government, the RCMP, the Attorney General, to enforce laws that are on the books. We have laws on the books that deal with a lot of this, and they just simply won't deal with it because they're big tech. That makes no sense to me. I want to really see what they're thinking of in terms of what that regulator is or what role that would be, because I think we can all agree that Bill C-10 was a badly thought out dumpster fire. There were some good ideas in it, but it surely was done in a very bad way. This is why I suggest we have a standalone officer of Parliament like the Privacy Commissioner who actually can report to Parliament and to Canadians, and I think that would be a better regulator than if we're going to establish some kind of quasi-new CRTC. I see that would be rife with problems.
And I'll check once more if we have a question on the phone. Operator?
Thank you. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. S'il vous plaît, appuyez sur étoile 1 maintenant pour poser une question. There are no further questions registered at this time. Nous n'avons plus de questions pour le moment.
Back to the room. De retour dans la salle. Mia?
Mia Rabson from the Canadian Press. I'm just wondering, is a new bureaucracy the answer, or can we not amend the existing structures we have to include better expertise on digital rights and the digital sphere?
I think if you look at the tools that we have, the Competition Bureau, man, it's like the 1980s show. They are not going to take on the antitrust issues. We look at the CRTC, it is the perfect example of regulatory capture. When was the last time anyone looked at the CRTC and thought, boy, they stand up for the little guy, they stand up for cell phone rates? The CRTC, to me, is completely unfit to do this job. So what we have in Canada, we have some really, really strong roles. The officers of Parliament, the Ethics Commissioner does excellent work, the Privacy Commissioner does excellent work, the Information Commissioner does excellent work. I think if we had a commissioner who's established to deal with issues of algorithms and issues to deal with how the digital system works, it would be much more focused and it would be much less, I think, open to the kind of regulatory interference that we've seen from, the big, the big telecoms in the CRTC. I mean, if you look at how the big telecoms have used CRTC, we certainly don't want Facebook, Google, and Amazon getting their clutches in there either. So this would be a much more simpler way of dealing with it.
And further to my colleague's question, what can Canada actually do to address a company that has a Canadian presence but is not actually a Canadian company? What laws do we have, or do we need to actually give ourselves more powers that we can actually do something about this?
It's amazing. We have Mr. Kevin Chan. He's former Liberal insider. He's their political guy. He goes and meets with all these ministers, and yet we're told that Facebook is not a Canadian company. How is that? Facebook gets all manner of revenues from Canadian citizens, and yet we're told they're not a Canadian company. They are operating in Canada. They're a Canadian company. We need to hold them accountable. And this fiction that since they're somehow up in the ether, they're not accountable, they are accountable. And when we're talking about the breakdown of civic discourse, when we're talking about spreading disinformation, when we're talking about fundamental threats to democratic life, Canada needs to step up and take these guys on, and we need to work internationally, and some of that work has already started. And I think that it's time that Facebook, Google, and the other tech giants complied with national law.
Prochaine question, next question, Menaka.
Hello, Menaka Raymond-Wilms, The Globe and Mail. In your remarks today, you called Bill C-10 twice now a dumpster fire, but you also added the second time that there are some good ideas in it. Is there anything salvageable in Bill C-10 and previous legislation that happened this spring, or do you think that new internet legislation needs to start completely fresh?
Well, I think the problem with C-10 was that they focused on one element of the much broader issue in Facebook, which was the fact that an enormous amount of content is being used for free to drive Facebook's bottom line, but artists and writers are not getting any part of that. Facebook would say they're not a broadcaster, but since their algorithms actually decide what you see, they are. Same with YouTube. So the idea of having them pay into the overall art system, I think, was a reasonable idea. But that they couldn't come up with a clear definition of user-generated content created a lot of unnecessary difficulty. So I think there's a lot of distrust now over C10 that was unnecessary if they had written a proper bill and a simple and clear bill. Bill C11, the privacy legislation, is fundamentally flawed. It will not protect citizens. It will protect the facial recognition technologies. It will make it harder for the Privacy Commissioner to do his work. So that bill has to be absolutely scrapped. And the Prime Minister is now deep sick C10 because he called an election. So I'm saying to the Prime Minister, if you're going to bring legislation back, bring it back clear, bring it back coherent, in a way that Canadians can say, I understand why you're doing this. People could not really understand what the heck was going on with C10 half the time.
And this morning you outlined 6 key steps that you want to see in any coming internet legislation. But of these 6, all of which are important, as you say, is there any 1 or 2 that are really key for you and the NDP that you would want to see in any upcoming legislation in order to support it?
Well, I think there's a couple of, the 2 key areas are the privacy rights of citizens. We have to protect the privacy rights of citizens. We have to stop talking about them as though they're consumers. These are citizen rights. So we have to address that. And it's the algorithms. It's the power of the algorithm and the misuse of the algorithm that's driving extremist content. That's something the Prime Minister has not talked about. So we talk about disinformation, hate news, we talk about broadcasting. It's the power of the algorithm. And the transparency there is very important. But the final point I'd made about the need to start getting some baseline data on the addictive damage that's being done by the use of our phones, by Facebook, by Instagram, WhatsApp, I think it's really speaks to a broader long-term social issue that we have to address. I'm putting that flag down now. Our parliamentary committee put that flag down. Ms. Hogan warned about it. We need to start actually looking at how the tools are being used by the tech giants to create addiction in young users.
I'll check one last time for a phone question. Operator, do we have a phone question?
Thank you. Please press star 1 at this time if you have a question. De nouveau, n'hésitez pas à appuyer sur étoile pour une question. We do have a question from Stephen Wetzel with the National Politics Reporter with Rebel.ca. Please go ahead. La parole est à vous.
Thank you. MP Angus, the Facebook whistleblower, after their testimony at the Senate last week, Facebook is now looking to limit internal message boards so that folks cannot see election interference and of the like discussions. How do you feel about Facebook limiting who can see their internal decision-making from the inside?
That's an excellent question. I think what's really disturbing about Facebook is this is a corporation that has absolutely no corporate accountability mechanisms anywhere. This is a massive fiefdom of Mark Zuckerberg, and we need to use the legislative tools to force more transparency so we know how decisions are being made. It is a classic move to go after the whistleblower by trying to shut down how people can access the information that's being brought out that shows the destructive power of this company. I think we need to look at that at the national level, but I'm certainly think it's something we need to look internationally to force more transparency on Facebook. And that would include, and it's something I didn't include it in my 6 points, but we need antitrust. It's time to break up the monopoly. It's time to start limiting that kind of unprecedented power, because this power is bigger than anything we've ever seen in the history of capitalism. The power of Facebook right now, Google, Amazon, has been called a kill zone of innovation, killing any possible competition, young startups, because of the massive power that they have from the profiling and the data. We're dealing with something that's bigger than anything we've ever dealt with. And, you know, the old GMs and the ExxonMobil, like the power of these companies is so much beyond anything we've ever dealt with. We need to start thinking about it, that these aren't just companies. These are mega power structures that could impact social democracy in profound ways. And so we need to be making them accountable to us so that we're not accountable to them.
And also looking at Facebook's ventures into Libra and Calibra, their cryptocurrency platform, can you speak a little bit to how Canada would need to regulate any currency platforms on Facebook?
Oh my God, who would ever let Facebook handle currency? Come on, people. Like, this is outrageous. This is a company with the worst corporate track record one can imagine. We wouldn't let them build bridges because we'd be going through the holes all the time because of their lack of corporate accountability. On issues of letting Amazon or Facebook get involved in insurance, in currency, there has to be real limits. And this is where we need to start going to clear antitrust. There has to be limits on how much is power that they can use to intervene and transform the economy. If Jeff Bezos wants to go off into space, well, he can go off into space. But don't let these guys get their hands on our banking system.
And one last question in the room. Mike?
Yeah, Mr. Angus, Mike Lecter with Global National. I just wanted to ask you, going back to the Prime Minister's visit today, and I know how critical you are of him, and it may come up short on many fronts, but what would it take from the Prime Minister today, either to say or do, for you to feel like his visit was worth it today and a success?
I really hope that the Prime Minister's visit today is about healing. I hope it is about recognizing the historic crimes. And I really hope it's about recognizing the ongoing responsibility to put an end to that. That's what he needs to send a very clear message. So he's going to have to do more than show up and say sorry. He needs to say that there's going to be the transformative powers for the communities on issues of child welfare, that they're going to end the court cases against survivors and end the court cases against the Indigenous children at the Human Rights Tribunal. They're going to need to put in place some kind of credible national plan to say what happened here are massive crimes. And what we didn't get out of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement is a sense of accountability for many of the people who were part of that. So I am hoping, and I also want to say that I am not here to speak for the people of Kamloops First Nation who are meeting with the Prime Minister. I leave it to them to tell us whether or not they feel this trip was worthwhile. But Canadians are expecting the Prime Minister to represent us at a historic moment. And up till now, he's talked the talk, but on the key areas, they're still missing. But I'm always hopeful that Canada will start to move forward. We need to move forward.
That concludes the press conference. Ici, me fait la conférence de presse. Merci.